It's the Forensic Lunch. I'm Dave.
And I'm Matthew.
And here with us on a special early broadcast is Mark Spencer. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
And Mark, it sounds strange to say this because it doesn't really make sense, but Mark appears to have stirred a controversy by releasing a tool that parses hibernation files in a different way. And people seemed unhappy about this. They generally seem concerned about Mark's contentions. And I got to see the tool and talk to Mark, and I thought the best thing that we could do is to get it out there so that people can ask questions and understand what Mark's doing and understand that this isn't just some random person trying to repackage someone else's work. This is altogether a new innovation in what we do. So don't be angry about new evidence. Be happy about new evidence. Be happy about the ability to get new things. That's what we want. We want to know more things. So with that being said, Mark, let's start because you haven't been on in a long time because it's very hard to get you. So let's start with who you are and what you do.
Right. So I'm the president of Arsenal Consulting, a digital forensics company in Chelsea, Massachusetts, right across the water from Boston. We focus really all our efforts on digital forensics, consulting primarily, but when we feel forced to get involved in software development, we will. This is one of those projects where we basically felt forced to get into it. So in terms of the reaction to the tool, we don't get out of our hole or our bunker. I mean, we literally work in a bunker, the old naval magazine in Chelsea, very often. So I think you have maybe the pulse of the community a little bit better than we do. All I'm aware of is a few tweets here and there. It sounds like you're aware of a lot more. So anyways, you already mentioned that we don't get online and talk very much or get to conferences and whatnot.
Right. But I mean, you have several tools that I use and that other people are now using a lot more. The one that I use probably the most, I think people are most familiar with, is the Arsenal Image Mounter. So that's something that you have out there and you actually recently updated.
The Image Mounter, small updates here and there. Yeah.
And a new GUI.
Right.
And then, of course, I'm a big fan of Registered Recon, which is something that I don't think people have still fully understood and adopted, and is a shame because they're missing some awesome evidence. Yeah,
that's kind of the issue we have with marketing. We're a very small company. We don't have any marketing people. So there was a point at which I've just kind of felt beaten down by trying to explain what we do that's different and why we got into the madness of software development. So now word just percolates slowly, and that's fine with us. And so with those two things that have been, at least the Image Mounter for sure has been kind of widely adopted and embraced because of what it allows you to do. You've now had a case that forced you to do another bit of research, which is usually how new tools get created. And so tell us about, what you encountered that led you to have to dig into the deep, dark rabbit hole that is the hibernation file. Okay, well, there's been a few instances where we knew there were interesting things within hibernation files outside of the active memory that they contain that are interesting to us. They're interesting, they're compelling, important to the case, but the kind of the way we and others have handled some of those particular things is by saying, they must just be in Slack, kind of this obtuse way, and we deal with them as one-offs rather than having some more systematic approach. And what happened most recently on our OTA TV case, that's a pretty well-known case that we've been working on over in Turkey, is we had this whole series of secure download or just download URLs that we knew were extremely important. So we found every reference to these download URLs everywhere on the disk. And we knew, even in compressed form, that a bunch of them were contained in a hibernation file outside of the active memory. So that's kind of where we started. So then we used a variety of tools that process hibernation files to go and look at those strings decompressed. And what we found is when we searched for those strings in the decompressed data from the tools we were using, is that there were no hits. Those strings didn't exist.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and then we figured, okay, well, maybe this is just a matter of making sure that the tools not only reconstruct active memory, but they also will go and hit all the, in this case, legacy compressed hibernation data. And the more we dug, the more we realized that, no, it's not that simple. Hibernation files are fascinating, and there's many different kinds of slack. Hibernation slack is a nice phrase to use as an umbrella to encompass all the different kinds, but we're talking about distinctly different kinds of slack that have to be treated differently.
Okay. Now, we're using the slack in the generic term, as in the area of the range of allocated space in between the end of what was actively present and what was priorly there. And so I think that's probably the first misconception then is this because the hibernation file isn't overwriting itself and clearing stuff out before it writes it again to the disk, or is this because this is also in memory?
Well, I think the primary issue is that each time you have a hibernation, of course, the compressed data is not going to be the same size between those hibernations. So as you have different sized hibernations over time, you're going to have different types of slack left behind. One example that we tweeted about recently was a case. This is a legacy hibernation file, Windows Vista. We recovered 16 distinct levels of slack from that file. I don't have the dates right in front of me. You might have some of our tweets there, but essentially the machine was seized March 2011. And just based on doing some of the NTFS artifact or record recovery, we could tell that the 16th level of slack, which is kind of 17 relative hibernations back, was from May 2010. So to us, this is a big deal. We have 16 independent levels of slack beyond what was in the active memory, and we know what their relative order is. And with NTFS record recovery, we can start to date them. We can have some sense of when these particular hibernations occurred. And as far as we're concerned, if we recover 5 NTFS records from any particular level, that's important. You know, it's better than 0.
Yeah. Well, I mean, anytime you get more evidence, it's usually, worth the effort, especially when you're talking about, and as far as I want to make sure I understand this, because I think I understand this, I want to make sure that I spell this out for everyone else who's unfamiliar, is that each one of these levels of slack, as you're talking about, are from previous times when the machine is hibernated.
Right, and this is probably a good time for me to back up, and
Yes.
I'm gonna quantify the way we do it internally, the 3 types of hibernation slack. So these are, we can descend further down the rabbit hole, I guess, but this will simplify things. So we have what we call the decompressed slack, whether it's from the legacy format or whether it's from the modern format. So what we're referring to there is basically, here's the stuff, here's the data from previous hibernations. So that's pretty straightforward. That's the slack from previous hibernations that needs to be decompressed. Then we have the second level, or the second type of slack. We call it raw slack. So this is raw. This is slack that we know belongs to a previous hibernation, but we may not know which level of hibernation, which particular hibernation it belongs to, and or it's partially overwritten. It's kind of broken data. So we call that raw slack. I guess you could say it could be lost and or broken, but we know it's related to a hibernation. So then the third kind of slack is what we call non-zero data after all valid levels of slack. Okay. Now, this is kind of like file slack. This is the theory of, okay, this is everything at the end. After we deal with the active memory reconstruction, we deal with identifying and extracting hibernation data from particular hibernations. We deal with the raw slack. Now we're left with, okay, what's all this non-zero stuff, actual stuff, data, that's after all the valid levels of hibernation. Now, going into this, we thought, well, it's probably not that much data, especially on a computer that's been heavily used. But we had one of our sample cases while we were building this tool was a Windows 10 machine. So after we dealt with the active memory, the normal decompressed slack from particular levels, the raw slack, we were left with over a gigabyte of data. This is from an 8 gigabyte hibernation file from a Windows 10 workstation that was heavily used. So that 1 gigabyte of data, our theory is at this point, we're dealing with that information. That's data that predates the hibernation file. Whether when the hibernation file, something happened to it, it's resized. These are the clusters on disk, and there were some things on those clusters on disk. We don't know exactly where all that data comes from, but we know there's some value to it. We recover tens of thousands, if not more, of NTFS records from that data. So we see value not only in extracting it and dealing with it, but in quantifying it, knowing that, okay, this is not related to a particular hibernation.
Now, that brings up the second good point about this, so that we need to make sure people understand, which is you're running a tool that gives you ranges of memory that previously existed were in the hybrid file, but it's not like there is a process map that lets you understand for those ranges of memory what processes are running within them, the kind of data that you should expect. You're going to have to do something additional with those memory chunks.
Yes, I think I got all of that. I'm having the issue where the sound is cutting out on me, like a low bandwidth connection. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, and you just came in fine. So maybe I blame that on the OpenVPN, maybe. So I think I heard what you said, and yeah, I mean it's.
I can repeat it.
Okay.
My guess is I'm bringing the microphone closer to my mouth now. It could just be I was too far away from the mic. We just got reset back up. So my question and to you and to explain to everyone who's watching is, you have a tool that exposes ranges of memory that used to exist actively, and they're written to the hibernation file, but it's not like there's a process map attached to those ranges of memory. It's not like what to expect from those ranges of memory. It's not like you have a process header or a mapping of allocated memory or anything else to kind of give you some structure to it. So you're going to have to take additional steps to deal with these recarved memory chunks.
Yes and no. So there's memory. In terms of there's two elements I think there. One is, right, of course you can't expect any previous hibernation, any previous level of slack to be complete. Right. It's not going to happen. So, but that's not fatal in the sense that there's all kinds of memory tables left behind, regardless of whether the previous hibernation is maybe 30% of the thing has been nuked by the latest hibernation, maybe 70% of it has been nuked, but there's still those memory tables left behind, so we could still start to put things back into the relative order that they should be in. So it's really just a matter of coming up with the logic and stepping through everything carefully. And as you step through each level, you have some confidence about where things go.
Okay, so you have identified that there are additional regions, sometimes up to a gig of additional data from prior hibernations. You've identified that there could be memory structures. What all are you finding inside of this, and how are you working with it?
We focus, for the most part, at this point, on NTFS records. You guys probably know, even from some of the things that we publish online about cases that we can discuss, we do a lot with the NTFS records. So that's really number one. Number two is we take really any of our tools that can do carving for different types of things, and we fire them out against what we've extracted with hibernation recon. So whatever you can imagine would be in the active hibernation, the active memory, is the kind of stuff you can find. So anything, anything. It just so happens that we really focus at this point on NTFS records, internet history, webmail artifacts. Those are the things that have been really compelling to us in our cases since we've been dealing with hibernation files this way.
Very cool. And so right now, you're bringing that data then out of the tool's exposing the data that it carved out, and then so you're passing then the third-party tools to then carve and deal with it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at this point, the amount of time and effort just to get to where we are, to have the foundation to go and identify everything that's in the hibernation file and extract it out, it's been an enormous amount of effort, but worthwhile. Now we have something reliable that can deal with every version of Windows that at least we've come across. And like we've been saying but amongst ourselves, that really the mission here is to extract every drop of blood from the hibernation files. Mm-hmm. So some tools as they exist now, some other tools, they will take a hibernation file and reconstruct the active memory and give that back to you as the user. Now, that's fine. If the intent is just to do that with the hibernation file, no big deal. I think where some of the confusion comes in our community right now is that the output files look massive. You throw in a 12 gigabyte hibernation file and you have this, maybe you have a 12 gigabyte output file, even if only active memory is reconstructed. That's because the output file is full of zeros. Okay. So what we started doing and what other people may want to do is at the first layer, go ahead and zip up this output that you're getting from your tools, from your, the hibernation output, and get a relative sense for, well, what's happening here? What am I getting? Some other tools with the legacy Express Slack will just look for every Express header and decompress it. That's good too. As long as everyone is on the same page in terms of, okay, this is what my tool is doing and this is what the limitations are. If all the tool is doing is reconstructing the active memory and then kind of in a way brute forcing every time it comes across an Express header and decompressing it, there's some really serious things that you're still missing from the hibernation file. And that's what we're trying to address.
We have a question for you. This is from cproxy. What happens when the software starts to encrypt its data structures to protect against memory dump reverse engineers?
Okay. Well, the software has already done that. David, I'm still having a little bit of trouble hearing you, but I get most of the context. Yeah, I mean, if the machine has BitLocker and especially TPM, the hibernation files are already armored. So at this point, we identify that it's been impacted by TPM, but we can't really do anything with it at this point. So on our end, dealing with BitLocker and TPM encrypted hibernation files is in our queue. Someone else may know that's watching this forensic lunch, whether it's how reasonable attacking those things are. But we've discussed it, but we haven't really developed yet.
Okay, and hopefully if I just speak directly to the microphone, it'll be clearer. Still not sure exactly what the issue is this time around. The other thing that I think he's talking about isn't so much about BitLocker or TPM, but more about the individual software, the malware running that decides to encrypt itself in memory. And cproxy, what I would say to you is that they already are doing that, but of course they have to decrypt themselves to run. So that's how good malware reversers, they find the part that's decrypted already for execution, and then they focus on finding the keys to get the rest.
Yeah, at that level, it's outside of my department. So we would extract out all the Slack, we'd decompress it, and we'd send it into your department, David.
Malware reverse engineering is not our department. We prefer file system reverse engineering.
No, there's a couple of things I should mention to you guys, lest people think that even after this explanation, we're still not doing interesting things. There's the issue of, well, what about some of this partially overwritten data? Can we brute force decompress it? So right now, what we're doing is the brute force decompression of data that's kind of damaged or partially overwritten from these Slack levels we identified, where the end of the data, some portion of the end of the data is missing, but the header is still there. So we go ahead and decompress that kind of stuff. But it's also possible, in theory, and actually we've done it, we just haven't implemented this yet in the tool, to brute force decompress when the header is missing. And you might think, well, okay, this is just madness. How realistic is that? I mean, how many of those things are you going to find in the valid Slack and in the raw Slack? Actually, there's a lot of it in the raw Slack. So we went and we saw, okay, how many MFT records, for example, can we recover in this case? So we used one sample hibernation file and recovered 5 MFT records. So from an 8 gigabyte hibernation file. So are we talking about a waterfall of information? No, but it's 5 MFT records that we never would have seen otherwise, unless we were doing some level of brute force decompression of partially overwritten data.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well,
one more. One more. Okay, so another Windows 10 workstation.
Yes.
And I sent you, I think, a screenshot of this. We realized after parsing all the, what we call the modern levels of Slack, that we came across more hibernation data that we could put into particular levels. And we realized, okay, well, this is legacy Slack data. These were hibernations from Windows 7 before this machine had been upgraded to Windows 10. I don't have the number of levels right now, but it was I believe five or more independent levels of Slack from when this workstation was running Windows 7. And we're talking about 640 megabytes of data. Again, another heavily used workstation.
Yeah.
So it's not academic. This stuff is practical. I'm hoping that the message really for everybody is get a better handle on exactly what your tools are doing. Just because the output size is massive, potentially, really doesn't mean a whole lot.
That's definitely true. I mean, we see that with USM journals where, because our forensics tools aren't respecting the fact that they're Slack, they can pull up 500 gigs of the size data, but there's really only a couple hundred megs of data actually allocated within it. So there's no question that becomes an issue. Here's my next question for you then is that, one, where can people go and get this tool? And then two, what's next? So the tool, everything happens online for us because we are consultants first and software developers second. So we try to make everything as efficient and automatic as possible. So the purchasing and the licensing all happens from our website, the arsenalrecon.com website. Next up, I would say, is a GUI, because we know people want the GUI. The NTFS artifact recovery, because we think that we can do some really interesting things just based on all the time that we spent with the hibernation files. So we would call it, maybe as opposed to just regular NTFS record recovery, relatively advanced or aggressive. To give you a quick idea, normally, probably with you guys too, we don't expect to find many log file entries scattered around a forensic image, out on disk. No. But in the hibernation files, especially in the Slack and even in the non-zero, we're finding tons of them. Interesting. That makes sense.
Tons of the records, the log file records. So that's the kind of stuff that's really juicy to us. And we realize we need to make it just a kind of a checkbox. Our users hit it and you pop out a CSV. So that will be coming in the next major version. The batch ingestion, and I would say more of the brute force decompression. Those are the four biggies. But at this point, we feel like we've got the core functionality squared away for everything from Windows XP to Windows 10.
And so speaking of Windows 10, this is one thing that I've seen a lot of talk about. I wanted to see what you were experiencing. So Windows 10 has compressed memory pages, are those? I would guess that the compressed memory pages then are making their way into the hibernation structure.
Are the compressed memory pages making their way into the hibernation file?
Yeah.
Because my employees aren't here, I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer on that. In a kind of a general sense, nice thing about especially the active memory in the hibernation file is that everything is paged aligned properly for you.
Right.
So with very little work, you essentially reconstruct everything. But then after that, there's all kinds of other things you might have to deal with. You might have to deal with fragmentation, paging, the page addressing, maybe what you just mentioned. We did have one, we thought, relatively insane example where within decompressed hibernation data, we found more legacy express compressed data. We eventually realized that the developer was looking at a hibernation file when his computer hibernated. So it turned into a day's worth of really complete insanity for us trying to figure out how this hibernation data existed in the way it did, until we realized, okay, this user was actually interacting with the contents of a hibernation file.
Interesting. All right. Matt, you want to ask any questions, and let's see if your mic works better than mine?
This is fascinating. One, it hits on something that I like to talk about, which is knowing what your tool's doing and knowing what it's giving you. And I think that is a point that has been hit on a lot recently. And I think if you were at OSDFCon, even Eric will hit on it quite a bit, on just know what your tool's doing and know what it's giving you back. Because this is great. I mean, you're explaining a very in-depth how it's working, and I don't think that there was ever really a controversy over the tool or anything. I think there was a misunderstanding of what it's doing compared to other things, and I think you explained that really well. I mean, to me, it's amazing, and I have a lot of respect for you, especially because I love it when someone they find an issue, they research it, they build a tool for it, and they really get into what they're doing. Because I mean, that's how we started off with the log file stuff. We were finding records in the log file that were very relevant to a case. And it's like, well, we don't understand this data structure. We need to start looking into it because we need to understand what these hits are about. We need to give it more context. So obviously what you're doing with this is you've had an issue, you wrote a tool for it, you know how it's structured, you've explained it really well. I love that. I absolutely love that.
I appreciate it. And I hope, just based on our output file names in folder structure, you can see that on the FAQ on our website, that helps people in terms of figuring out, well, where exactly is this data coming from? And then when they look at the file sizes for all those various output file names and our descriptions in the FAQ, maybe get a new sense of appreciation for hibernation files. I mean, at this point, we think they're one of the most fascinating things on a Windows computer system, of course, because we've been, engaged with them for, it feels like, ever. But really a couple months of this kind of stuff, and we're still finding things we think are worth pursuing.
Oh yeah, it's amazing, because every time we look at just the log file and we're like, hey, we want to look into adding something, or we see something that we don't quite understand, we re-look into it. And it's like every time, even the MFT, I mean, you see people coming out all the time with, hey, did you know this exists in the MFT? MFT's been around forever, but we still can keep looking at these artifacts. Link files, great example. A lot of stuff being done on link files and shell items lately, extension blocks, and we keep re-looking at forensic artifacts, and we keep on finding more and more insight into how we can use them. And you're doing this with the hibernation file, and it's amazing. It's great work.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any more questions for Mark? We'll give the audience a second to check it out. I know this is an odd time broadcast, so if you're watching this recorded, and hopefully you can understand what I'm saying, and you want to have a question, leave it in the comments, and we'll make sure to get them to Mark. See what Mark can do to respond. But otherwise, Mark, thanks for making time. Oh, David, you fixed your mic. Okay, I hope that's true. Otherwise, thanks for making time to come on, Mark. For those who don't know, Mark it's hard for Mark to make time, especially for Mark and I to sync our schedules. We've been trying to actually meet in person for over a year now. So it's great when this stuff can work out, so we can actually get some more information out to all of you, you can understand what it is Mark's doing. Here's a question for you, Mark. If someone is interested but still skeptical, could they reach out to you for a demo or something like that?
Sure, absolutely. We hope people are skeptical. Really, we were skeptical. We were even surprised by some of the things we found, and we think it would be nice if other people go through that same kind of round of being skeptical, testing, trying, seeing what the possibilities are. People are going to find more things than we've found, and hopefully they'll tell us about them, some of the fun things that they're able to do.
The one other thing I wanted to make sure to bring up, because it's something else that I was hearing from a couple people, is it's not like you're the first person who's ever found an instance of a Slack in the hibernation file.
Right.
So, but what you've done is you've gone way beyond that, and you found way more stuff. But it's not like you just simply found an old blog post from a couple years ago and said, haha, I'm going to roll with this.
No. I mean, we don't think that software development is lucrative, nor do we think it's fun. So I hope that explains kind of our take on that. If people are saying that, all you really have to do is go look at the features on our website, and I think just looking at the features and our output file name descriptions, you'll get a sense for, okay, it wouldn't have been possible to look at a blog post and come up with this, irrespective of the fact that we hit the modern format, the Windows 8, 8.1, and 10.
I think what it is so many of us have been burned by bad marketing, bad vendors, that anytime someone says, hey, we found something new, there's kind of two reactions. Either one, it's pure skepticism, or this has already been found and you're simply rehashing someone else's work because it seems tangentially related to something else that they've seen. Or two, they're angry because there's something that they weren't seeing before, and now they're worried about how it impacts their past cases. I mean, I can definitely tell you when Matt and I come out with something, especially with the original TriForce research, there was a range of emotions that we experienced from people. And there's one guy who we secretly have dubbed the angry guy from one of our large presentations. I'm going to publicly talk about this because people need to know. But Matt and I were giving a talk, and Matt's laughing because he thought I'd never say this. And you could actually see the anger building in his face as we were talking about what we can do and some of the new stuff. And he was visibly upset by the idea that we were doing these things, and he wouldn't talk to us afterwards. So I'm still unsure I don't know if we rained on his parade because he was doing something similar, or if he was just mad because he didn't believe it, or maybe he just didn't like us. I don't know. But
I think Matthew did something to him that you may, maybe he hasn't fessed up to. Yeah, I understand. I've gotten a whiff of that. You guys probably, I'm sure, have gotten more because you interact with people more than we do. But I don't want a single person to invest in our tools without having evaluated them first. I'm pretty clear about people with that. If I get an email that asks about purchasing information, and I don't think that they've downloaded one of our latest builds, my normal course of action is to say, hey, if you haven't done it yet, here's a link. Please evaluate what our tool does and make sure it does what you want it, or what you expect it to do.
Yep. Cool. All right. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Matthew. We just got back from OSDF Con.
Yes, I'm tired.
I'm tired.
It was fun. It was a good time. Got to meet. What I love about OSDF Con is just the people that we get to hang out with. So it's fantastic. If you're thinking about going, but you're just kind of undecided on if you should fly out for it or not, highly recommend it. Especially if you're a technical person, if you're doing any type of research and development, these guys are fantastic people. So I think it's one of my favorite places to go for conference.
It's fun in that it's a very short and brief conference. I mean, the main conference day is one day. It's one day of talks, and what's interesting is that it's a focus on just open source tools and research and technology. So it's all stuff that you can immediately take away from and learn from. But more importantly, it's the people that are developing some of the tools that we all rely on, they're there. And you get to kind of hang out and talk with them. And while the conference officially ends, I think, at 5, and then there's networking reception, if you just hang out afterwards, the discussions go way into the evening and may involve a bottle of fancy scotch.
This is true. You also might be in for a long night.
You also may be in for a very long night and be very tired the next day when you fly home.
Also, the day before the conference, they have workshops, which are fantastic. Eric Zimmerman did one on his C-sharp tools. It was great. Jamie was there doing volatility, I believe.
Yep, and Brian was talking about Python scripting with Autopsy.
Yeah, so there's stuff to do. I kind of hope it does grow. I would like a second day. I would be okay with that. Because I feel like it's hard to justify spending the money on flying out there for just one day.
I mean, flights are cheap, I guess. Flights are cheap these days. I mean, flights are cheap. It's Westin. It's it's not very expensive to stay there for a night. Or you could, I mean, if you're crazy, you can just fly in and out. I would recommend that. Just flying in the morning, leaving. But more importantly, I mean, the metro area around there. I mean, the reason, to make it clear, it's not a small conference. There are 500 people who register and attend. But the amount of people who live in that general metro area who are interested in this work is pretty huge.
Yeah.
And you can meet a pretty large variety of people who do different things.
Yeah.
But this year, I mean, there was Michael Cowen was there talking about recall. We were there. The volatility people were there. Zimmerman was there.
Bradley was there talking about AFF4. And
the good Dr. Schatz.
So AFF4 is something interesting. I'd like to talk about it for a second real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see the potential of it. And right now it's kind of in the state of we need more adoption for it. But we see that GER's using it.
Yep.
Recall's using it.
Yep. Vemetry is using it.
Yeah.
That's Bradley's tool.
And that's amazing. We want to start using it.
Yep.
It's a little hard. There's very little documentation currently on kind of how to implement it, but we're wanting to use it for some future projects. It's a really neat technology, and I think it's going to speed up a lot of things. So I think it's something to look out for coming up in the future.
I would agree. That, and on a future episode, we're going to be getting the guys from Google on who have been working on the TimeSketch project and their new kind of utility that kind of links GER and Plazo and TimeSketch together to kind of automate things called Time Wolf or DT Time Wolf. There was another excellent presentation they did. If you've never seen their presentations or done their demos, when they do TimeSketch stuff, it's always a scenario involving one of my favorite shows, Community, and the investigative cases of Greedale High protecting their secret air conditioning research. What's the difference between DFIR in the private sector versus public sector, if you feel comfortable sharing? From Old Purplebeard. That's a very good question. I would say the difference really is two things, for me at least. Number one, I just realized that I never changed the tag here. Number one, it's where the data is going. So for instance, when you're doing forensics in the private sector, there's two ultimate goals, well, three really. One, if you're doing it for an incident response purpose, then you're doing it to understand what the scope and nature of the breach was. You're reporting to the company that you're working for, either the consultant or internally. And really the only time that it goes beyond that scoping is that if the data affected is required by law for a notification. And then you have to then worry about the litigation that may follow. There is a second type of internal investigation that happens private sector, and that's just within a company. Employee investigations, internal fraud investigations, things that you handle internally may result in termination or discipline, but aren't going to actually leave the company's confines. And then lastly, you have people like us who are doing work in response to litigation. And so we're, doing forensics in order to discover, what happened and what can we prove and what can we testify to. It's for, some kind of civil action or support of some kind of criminal prosecution. So that's kind of one bucket on the traditional DF side. On the IR side, going into the malware and the threat intel and everything else, there is a very large community that continues to build of people who on the private side are just doing malware research, malware reverse engineering, threat intelligence, open source threat intelligence, building these feeds and these IOCs and trying to find patterns and campaign tracking and all the rest. And they're doing this in support of these private companies to try to give them the same kind of information that in theory, the government is developing for themselves. I've never been personally employed by the government side, but my understanding is on that side of it, it's very rare that the work that you're doing, unless you're working specifically for OSI or CID or something like that, it's taking people into a court martial. If you're doing some kind of media exploitation or if you're doing some type of intelligence work, that the majority of your work is going to further a mission or a goal or a campaign, some kind of targeted action against an adversary or a group. But it's not like it's work that's going to then bubble up to the public view and have to be defended. So I would say our timelines are usually longer in how long we get to look at something. On the IR side, it's definitely shorter, but for us on the DF side, we sometimes can spend months, if it can be large litigation, especially on the law enforcement side, on the criminal prosecution side. I mean, you could have years possibly with this evidence as you work through it, and maybe new tools come out, and you go back and reevaluate things before either indictments, before trials. So I would say that we have a lot more time to kind of think things through and to test and to research things. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest differences that I see that's kind of splitting DF and IR farther apart is the amount of time we get to spend working with something. When you're doing an IR in an active incident, you have very little time because you're trying to stop the pain. You may let the wound bleed a little bit to understand where the blood's coming from, but as soon as you've identified the source, you're less worried about how the wound was created, but more how far down the wound goes and how many organs are affected, so that you can actually stitch it up and stop the bleeding and then get back to living. On the DF side, it's more, it's post-mortem, right? So the patient's dead. We're not worried about the bleeding anymore, but we want to now understand how that wound came to exist, and we're willing to do whatever type of reconstruction it takes in order to replicate that wound, so that we can describe how it happened and when it could have happened and who could have been involved in it happening and all the rest. And so what I'm seeing is that because those fuses in IR are so short, and people want it done so quickly, and then usually once the motivating event is ended, the motivation to then go further without some kind of external pressure to go find out the true source, if the true source can even be known, is very low, because the reason that they have involved either a consultant or anyone else internally or externally is because they want to stop the pain, whether they're notified externally by law enforcement, whether it was the credit card brands saying, hey, by the way, we're noticing a pattern of fraud, or if someone internally with the company caught it. The business's objective isn't, there's no profit to be made in understanding the true source and nature of a breach. That could actually be more liability than it hurts. Helps. It could hurt more than it helps. The reason that we can spend so much time on the DF side is because we have identified someone with assets that can either be defended or be prosecuted, depending upon which side. You work both sides in the civil world pretty easily without much worry about what people think of you, which is different from the criminal world. I'll talk about that too. I would say probably the biggest thing there is that there is some monies that can be recouped from losses, or attorney's fees recouped, or there could be rights wronged by restricting where commerce can be done. So restricting who they can talk to, or clients they can work with, technologies they can develop, whatever it is. If you've identified, there is a person within the arm and reach of the judicial system of your company, your country, then yes, digital forensics can become a way for the company to recover those costs and to do things outside of just insurance, unless you're on the defense, in which case insurance can cover those costs rather than it coming directly out of you. And because litigation is well understood, typically those costs are directly covered under the errors and omissions, rather than the talk of cyber insurance and all the rest, and whether or not it applies to these instances. So I would say that's one side. The other side that I think is really interesting, especially for a lot of ex-law enforcement that come out and ex-government people, is that if they're used to working in the criminal system, that a lot of them, I've noticed, are more comfortable doing criminal defense than they are working in the civil prosecution or civil defense, because in the criminal arena, they understand the rules and they understand who the players are and what they should and shouldn't do, and understand, if I were to critique my own work, this is how I approach it. Where the civil side is this big, vague world where, there's no longer all of these strict rules because we're, a much lower burden of proof. And there's depositions and reports and all sorts of other crazy stuff. So I've noticed that most of the people who are doing criminal defense tend to be ex-law enforcement because of that reason. It's the area they're already used to and comfortable with. But the other side of that, which is funny to me, is that especially in the United States, this isn't apparently as true in other countries. We talked about this with Dr. Schatz in Australia. I've talked about it with Lee in the UK. As in America, if you do criminal defense work as an expert, a forensic expert specifically, you are on the bad list. And I know, it's something that is kind of inherently understood. And, HCCIA, their membership rules say you can't do criminal defense if you want to be a member, and there's all sorts of restrictions out there. But really, there is a very adversarial system on the criminal prosecution side, the criminal defense side, where you're seen basically as someone who helps bad people get away with things if you do criminal defense. Now, we don't do criminal defense. We want to work, and be on good terms with the largest amount of people. But at the same time, I do think that maybe that's something that at some point someone should probably look at and address, is whether or not, potentially people are being denied right for proper representation, especially on the computer issues, because there is such a huge adversarial bias against it.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention, there's content that you get when you start doing defense work that, it's not something I would want to either.
Yeah.
So it's also on the type of person you are.
It's true.
There's stuff that I don't want
ever to see.
Deal with.
There's a reason we've never done criminal prosecution stuff. I never joined law enforcement because I never wanted to see contraband images. It's not something that I particularly want to have in my life. So, all that being said, thank you for the question. I actually think that was a great question. I hope that helps you kind of put some perspective of maybe what's out there. I don't know if you're considering a career in DFIR now, if you're a student, or if you're already in the industry considering switching sides. Obviously, I think that what we do is pretty great. I really like the long cycle of DF. I really like the long cycle of litigation. I think it provides you an opportunity to really figure stuff out in the long term. However, we don't talk about it much, but we do some IR. And it's fun we do it, but I don't know if I want to do it all the time constantly. So, Matthew, you have updated our GitHub page.
I have.
Let me go ahead and pull that up. Yep, FGC.
FGC OSDF Con 2016. So we've got our slides loaded up on there and some notes about how we did what we presented on.
So if you don't know, we do have a GitHub page for all the different projects that we release as a company. There's also some stuff on my GitHub page as well. Probably need to combine those at some point. And if you go to the OSDF Con 2016 repository, you want to talk about what's in here?
So our talk was basically on the on nested data and how a lot of the forensic artifacts that we deal with contain a lot of nested data. It's just how they're structured, and that's okay. It's a good thing, actually. But it goes back to knowing the tool you're working with and understanding what it's giving you, because what we see a lot of times is the majority of tools that we use when parsing forensic artifacts like the MFT, event logs, link files, we're getting back linear data. And so in our talk, what we kind of hit on is the fact that there's two kinds of output that you kind of need from a tool. One is output for analysis and output for people. And a lot of times what you get from a tool is output for people, and that's great, except for it can leave stuff out. So we start talking about, okay, nested data is usually in the form of JSON. It could also maybe be in the form of XML, but the majority of the time it's in JSON. Well, how do you go through as a person JSON and actually do analysis on it? It's very hard because nested structures are very difficult to view as a human. But you still need it because there's stuff that's contained within this nested data that you don't generally get out of flat output. And when we start looking into nested data, we can start realizing that, hey, there's stuff in here that we can correlate with other artifacts. So our talk was on how you can use that within SQLite to hold nested data in the form of JSON, how you can query JSON objects within SQLite, and then how you can do that correlation with other artifacts. So we look at event logs, we look at the nested data that can be found within event logs, how you can create templated reports basically for humans out of the output for analysis. We look at link files, what type of data structures we find within link files, and how we can correlate that with other artifacts. So then we give an example of correlation between link files and shell bags to show how you can actually figure out which shell bags went to which volumes via their volume serial number, making the correlation between links and shell bags.
Right, and so we actually have the PowerPoint presentation up there, so you can directly go download and review that, as well as links to the different tools that we use in the presentation. I would think beyond that, probably at one point we're going to have to do a broadcast just to kind of walk people through how to do it.
We had 30 minutes to do all of this,
yes.
And this is a lot to cover in 30 minutes. But yeah, I think we'll probably throw out some blog posts on it. And I'm guarantee you we'll have more presentations going into the future on this type of stuff. Last year, we did pretty much the same thing, just with Elasticsearch and looking at nested data and how you can start making these correlations with your data stored in Elastic. This year, we did SQLite because it's kind of easier to get to. You don't have to worry about spinning up a Elasticsearch node.
Yep.
And it's readily available to be done. It's easy. So
I think that's it.
Yeah, I think we should do this more in presentations.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. I know it was an off-timed, ill-informed broadcast, but I really wanted to get it out there. I wanted to take advantage of Mark's time we could, even though both Matt and I are both recovering from the late nights at OSDFCon and all the fun that we had there. But expect to see more things. I'm still going to be shooting for 2 broadcasts a month. I'm looking right now in November, trying to figure out what Fridays in November we could possibly do this from. I'm going to be in London in November, and then at the main FireEye Cyber Defense Summit in early December. Other than that, I think that's it. So we'll put out a schedule. We'll start trying to get better at communicating. Hopefully, this is the new YouTube system, how they switches over is working out. And the results of the poll also that I ran was interesting. It looked like the vast majority of you prefer episodes with tool developers actually showing how to use their tools, and how-tos were the second, with the third option being the conference broadcasts. But the vast majority was tool developers walking through their tools, which makes sense to me. So we'll see what we can do to recruit more people. And of course, if you out there are watching this, say, boy, I have a tool I wish people knew more about. It doesn't matter if it's open source or commercial. What matters is it's interesting, it's accurate, and it's solving something that you think the larger community would know about. Just reach out to me. I actually have my Twitter DM set where anybody can send me a message, or you can email me, dcowem@g-cpartners.com. I'd love to hear from you, talk to you, and see what we can do to help you out. The whole point of the show is to just help, kind of boost the reach of all of these peoples and tools and things and research so that you can be more aware of what's possible, what you can do, and do better at the work you're doing or wanting to do, because forensics is fascinating and there is an ever-growing amount of data for us to look at. So why not, take the time it takes to make sure that you can be the best you can be. So thank you for tuning in. Thanks for watching. If you're watching this recorded, thanks for watching, but try to watch it live next time. I know it was hard this time, but it is more fun live. You get to ask your questions and talk to us. And we get to talk to you. And other than that, we'll see you next time.